Last year, I went to see a little movie called Avengers: Infinity War. I saw it at the Alamo Drafthouse in San Francisco, an independent cinema that cuts its own pre-roll clips. And before they screened Infinity War, they showed a pre-roll of two comic book guys sitting in their store talking about their favorite issues of the Avengers over the years. Storylines involving Captain America and Thor, and that lesser-known Marvel character, Doughboy. And I realized as I sat there that Infinity War wasn't really a movie for beginners. After 20-odd movies, it comprised over 30 characters and storylines and represented the culmination of more than a decade of filmmaking. On its face, it was a movie specifically designed for the comic book guys. And yet there I was with one of my best girlfriends, having never opened a comic book and still excited as all hell. So what was I doing there? It's hard to remember a time now before basically all the movies we saw were Marvel movies. But Marvel Studios actually started out as a licensing company. It used to license Marvel characters to other studios to make films and just clip the ticket on the profit. Marvel as a group was in dire financial straits and actually filed for bankruptcy in the mid-90s. And after a massive restructuring, they decided to take some of the characters they had left and see if they could self-finance their own films so that they could keep all of the revenue. Armed with a $525 million loan, they announced a 10-property series in 2005. It was an enormous creative gamble. While comic book characters had always existed in a continuous universe, moving in and out of each other's storylines, movie characters did not. You could do prequels and sequels, Superman 1, 2, and 3, but not a single shared universe comprising completely different films and characters. And more than that, other than the comic book guys, hardly anyone had heard of these lesser-known superheroes like Doctor Strange. And even fewer people had heard of the proposed cast. And yet here we are, 22 movies and $20 billion at the box office later. Like so many things in my life, I came to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or the MCU to its friends, through online fandom. Over the last few years, I started to notice more and more incredible fan work being created around these films. Hundreds of thousands of stories being written and shared online, and really gorgeous digital art. This kind of fandom is called transformative fandom. It's when you take the original source material and characters, you break and remake it, depict people in different scenarios, when you imagine what if.
There's a document here that looks to be fan fiction for the show Madam Secretary.
Oh, Sarge, I didn't know you were a fan of the Madam.
The show leaves Terry wanting more. I'm just filling in the gaps.
There's something generative about transformative fandom. It's about ideas and possibilities. And generalizing, it tends to be female fans and queer fans that engage in this kind of fanish activity. These are the demographic results of a recent survey conducted by the Fansplaining podcast that had over 17,000 responses. And I think that's in part because transformative fandom allows fans to create the representation that they don't necessarily see on screen. It allows them to tell their own stories or versions of the stories in which they see themselves. Transformative fandom tells the stories that exist in the cracks. Way back in '97, Henry Jenkins said, if you go back, the key stories we told ourselves were stories that were important to everyone and belonged to everyone. Fan fiction is the culture's way of repairing the damage done when our contemporary myths are owned by corporations instead of by the folk. And sometimes, transformative fandom exists just because it's fun. And we've been on a journey with transformative fandom. At first, authors and studios and publishers didn't really know how to react to this kind of work. There was a lot of pushback, attempts to stop this sort of activity as infringing copyright and so on. But now we're here, where the actors in these films are openly sharing and celebrating fan art on social media that depicts their characters and relationships never seen on screen. And when we're thinking about fandom, we can categorize it broadly, and again, I'm generalizing, but just go with me for a minute here, into two kinds. This transformative kind, and then the other more traditional kind, what we call curatorial fandom. Curatorial fandom celebrates the fans who know the most facts, who are the most expert about the canon. Sports fans are great examples of curatorial fans, where you're prized for knowing player statistics and starting lineups. Star Wars fans who understand the entire extended universe and can explain to you which bits contradict with what. Marvel fans who can explain to you how an arc reactor works or who the strongest Avenger is.
Voice activation required.
Banner.
Welcome, strongest Avenger.
What?
And generalizing, again, curatorial fans tend to be men. Now, in an ideal world, all of this glorious fanish activity would just happily coexist side by side. But unfortunately for some fans, the Marvel Universe is descending into chaos, and it's got nothing to do with Thanos. For the uninitiated among you, SJW stands for Social Justice Warriors, a negative label slapped on pretty much anyone interested in progressive ideas. So what's going on? Well, we get this kind of pushback whenever we get new bits of canon, a new Star Wars movie or a new Ghostbusters. And the pushback comes from curatorial fans who are angry that the canon is changing, that the things that they know to be true and have learnt are changing. Remember, in their framework, to be a good fan means knowing all of the things. So if you're changing the canon, then you're undermining that. Add to that the fact that pop culture itself is changing, not as fast as we'd like, but we are seeing more diverse casts and the inclusion of queer characters and characters of color. And for some fans, there's a perception that those changes are ruining the stories that they love because they're seeing a little bit less of themselves on screen. And so they lash out at the directors and the actors and the creators. Now, I want to make an important and giant qualifier here. I am not suggesting for a second that transformative fans are flawless or that there aren't significant problems in transformative fandom, particularly with regard to racism. Transformative fandom is overwhelmingly white, and that can lead to some really ugly behavior. Transformative fans deeply invested in the relationships they support can be just as ugly to TV showrunners and actors when a show goes in a direction they don't like. But what we're seeing with these angry curatorial fans is a kind of gatekeeping, the idea that there's a right way and a wrong way to appreciate a story. Let's look at a recent example. Recently, it was announced that Jason Reitman would be directing a new, back-to-being all-male version of Ghostbusters. And the reaction from curatorial fans online looked a lot like this. Keep your feminist bullcrap out of it. Don't make women the point of the story. And Reitman totally validated these responses by saying, we are in every way trying to go back to the original technique and hand the movie back to the fans. I consider myself the first Ghostbusters fan. I grew up with this franchise. I want to make a movie for my fellow Ghostbusters fans. And here's my question. Who are your fellow Ghostbusters fans? Who are you taking it from in order to hand it back? As Alicia Lutz wrote, this isn't really about the quality of the female Ghostbusters movie, about reboots in general, whether you liked it. It's honestly barely about Ghostbusters at all. It's about this idea that there's a right and a wrong way to be a fan, or a right and a wrong way to tell a story. It's about gatekeeping. And at its most preposterous, that leads some true fans to cut their own versions of films like The Last Jedi and Endgame. This version of Avengers Endgame weighs in at a lean 1 hour, 25 minutes, less than half the original runtime, and apparently contains no Brie Larson, no women at all, actually, and obviously no gay support group. So Marvel's just the latest franchise to find itself under the gun, first with the obviously racist criticism of Black Panther, and then Captain Marvel stepped into the firing line. Marvel boss Kevin Feige announced that Captain Marvel would be the most powerful character the MCU had yet seen. And the reaction from curatorial fans online, well, they weren't best pleased. Some of them were angry because they couldn't believe that he would make an announcement like this without providing evidence. Others were mad because it was just not accurate to the comic books. And still others were furious because it would take the spotlight away from more deserving white male characters like Captain America, Iron Man, and Thor. Brie Larson, the actor who plays Captain Marvel, fueled their anger by inviting interviewers on her press junket who weren't just white men, and by speaking openly at red carpets and press interviews about the need for queer representation in the MCU. And you can imagine how that went down. Angry fans downvoted Captain Marvel so aggressively ahead of its release that Rotten Tomatoes had to disable its pre-release voting mechanism. And the thing is, of course these fans are wrong. Stan Lee, the beloved creator of many of Marvel's most iconic characters, was speaking out openly against racism and anti-Semitism back in the 1960s. Even before that, in the golden age of comics, a woman was the creator and writer of Miss Fury. Miss Fury could fly a fighter jet and parachute out in a red satin ball gown and matching heels. She was a crack shot and, unusually for a Sunday comic, a single mother with a job. Over the decades, Jane Foster has taken a turn at being Thor. Captain America's best friend has been gay for over 30 years. Ms. Marvel, the comic book about a female Muslim superhero, topped the New York Times bestseller list. And let's go back to our friends who were so concerned about who the strongest Avenger really is and who gets to defeat Thanos. If you're looking for the actual, accurate comic book answer, it's Squirrel Girl. Yes, in the comics, Squirrel Girl defeats Thanos. And look, I don't want to tar all genuine comic fans with the same brush. Many of them are awesome. This is Bob Brettel. He's 56 and owns the world's largest personal comic book collection. And he loves diversity. He said in a recent interview, "I love Riri Williams as Ironheart. I love the idea of little girls and boys dressing up as Squirrel Girl. I don't sit back and say, gee, in my day, Iron Man was a white guy. I own maybe 1,000 Tony Stark comic books. They don't need to print another one of those for me." And yet there's still a powerful category of people determined to try and insist that we keep our politics out of their comic book movies. And you know what? Captain America didn't get iced for that shit. There's no such thing as apolitical entertainment. As soon as you're deciding that the pop culture we enjoy shouldn't reflect the world around us, you're making a political decision. That these are escapist fantasies, or that escapist fantasies are somehow neutral, is a myth that Stan Lee saw right through. He said, "From time to time, we receive letters from readers who want to know why there's so much moralizing in our mags. They take great pains to point out that comics are supposed to be escapist reading and nothing more, but somehow I can't see it that way. None of us lives in a vacuum. None of us is untouched by the everyday events about us, events which shape our stories, even as they shape our lives." And I think this is a really useful way for us to look at what's going on right now with our tech platforms and the way we build our products and services. Because we're seeing exactly the same arguments play out as the private companies who've built and now control all of our social infrastructure try to make the argument that they are platforms, not publishers. That it's not for them to decide the merits of an argument that someone wants to make or amplify using the tools that they've built. That they have no role in deciding what kind of shops they want to host, what kind of sites they want to protect. Remember when the people in this room were probably the only people in New Zealand on Twitter? Remember when Facebook was just a great way to catch up with friends you hadn't seen since high school and wasn't destabilizing democracy and enabling genocide? Remember when Tumblr was just a perfect meme machine? Remember Flickr before Yahoo killed it? Remember when Twitter was just the way a brilliant joke could spread and not a hellscape where people were harassed and lies and misinformation was spread? How did we get here? There are so many things we can point to, and we've talked about a lot of them today. Prioritizing revenue, and particularly advertising revenue, over everything, including privacy and safety. Prioritizing engagement because it's a way of getting us more revenue. Tools and platforms built by homogenous teams who never stop to think about the ways in which they would be used or misused. But today I want to focus in on just one. The myth that a digital space can or should be neutral. The incredible damage that that myth has caused, and what we might be able to do about it in the future. The myth we bought into early on was that a free and open internet would be a kind of global, social, technical utopia, where everyone had a voice and all the world's knowledge was available to be exchanged. As Paul Ford wrote recently, people, smart, kind, thoughtful people, thought that comment boards and open discussion would heal us, would make racism and sexism negligible and tear down walls of class. We were certain that more communication would make everything better. And even now, when we look at what's gone horribly wrong, we still see free internet devotees convinced that the answer lies just in abandoning these corporately controlled platforms for open source alternatives. And I get it. I grew up as a competitive international debater. I spent my teens and 20s 100% convinced in the marketplace of ideas, the rationality of people, that sunlight was the best disinfectant. Of course, the answer to bad information was more information. And instead, we've had to grapple with the fact that Nazis are back. It turns out that the marketplace of ideas has just proven that there really is a market for some truly terrible ideas. A market that's now being deliberately exploited for political aims. It turns out the devil didn't need any more advocates. And I think there's a really interesting question here about whether it's even possible to have the global community that we first envisaged. I really enjoyed this recent thread from Laurie Voss exploring this concept. So he said, we threw everyone together in a single common forum in the space of a generation, and we didn't stop to think about the fact that Dunbar's number, the cognitive limit to the number of stable social relationships we can have with people, is about 150. As he said, people often criticize cities for being cold and impersonal, but that's a feature, not a bug. Cities are survivable because we found a way to coexist without interacting, and the internet needs that feature. And it's not a question of dividing everyone up into silos of 150 people. It still needs to be a global network. We each need a different 150 people. But not a single common space where we're surrounded by shouting strangers. We need tools, control, granularity, different ways of thinking about our digital spaces and our relationships with one another. And instead, we have these platforms where likes and followers are our only metric. And it's a hopelessly blunt instrument for trying to determine value or meaning. And the more detailed ways of measuring engagement are kept back for brands and verified users and influencers. And we have no control over how our information is amplified or spread. Take Twitter Moments, for example, where Twitter aggregates a bunch of tweets around a theme or a news story of the day and shares them. I get a cute dog photo added to Pets of the Week, and I get heart eyes in my mentions for days. But I've seen women of color attract racist horror and hate when their tweet is amplified beyond its intended audience, and there's no way to opt out of this. Last year, a crowdsourced study by Amnesty International found that a problematic or abusive tweet is sent to a woman every 30 seconds. For women of color, 1 in 10 tweets they receive is abusive. So we find ourselves in this private cauldron, and the owners of this cauldron want to pay lip service to the idea that they understand the problem and that they're trying to help, while at the same time doing things like this. Speaking at TED earlier this year, Jack said that Twitter would be adopting 4 new metrics for conversational health: shared attention, shared reality, receptivity, and variety of opinion. But you'll notice all of these still center the idea that the space can be neutral. They are all values agnostic. Shared reality, for example, measures the percentage of a conversation that shares the same facts, but not whether those facts are true. As Anna Weiner in The New Yorker put it, at a time when conspiracy theories are gaining traction on social media, it seems naive to adopt a standard of conversational health that allows for mutual delusion. A mutual delusion that allows Jack to go on the podcast of an avowed anti-vaxxer and then tweet this: "Great conversation. Appreciate all you do." So we're supposed to believe that he understands the problems at Twitter and that he's taking them seriously, but is he though? Here's the thing, it's actually not possible to report a damaging lie on Twitter. I don't know if you've ever tried, but when you go to report tweet on the first screen, the only category it could come under is abusive or harmful, but when you hit the second screen, it doesn't fit any of the categories. So you can block or mute the person, but there is literally no way to report that a damaging lie is spreading. And it's the same rationale that allows Facebook to refuse to take down the doctored video of Nancy Pelosi. It's this idea of this myth of neutrality, that we're platforms, not publishers, that it's not for us to make ethical decisions. So Twitter won't ban the Nazis, even though we know they could. Recently, a Twitter employee let slip that one of the main reasons is because any such ban would catch too many Republican politicians. And in the last year, we've seen something even more horrifying. Right-wing commentators and politicians arguing that they are the ones who are victims of censorship and bias on tech platforms, that conservative voices are being silenced. In essence, they're arguing that they are suffering from the very actions we wish these platforms would take and won't. So much so that the White House has now built them a tool to help them report it. In fact, available data shows that right-wing content does as well as left-wing content on Facebook, that YouTube is boosting algorithmically right-wing content that radicalizes audiences, and that claims of conservative censorship or bias are nothing more than anecdotal. And yet Jack goes to the White House to appease a president who tweets about this imagined censorship and bias, but tells Representative Ilhan Omar that he won't take down a president's tweet that brought her a flood of death threats because it doesn't break Twitter's rules. And what I'm saying is, if those are the rules, then change them. And it's not just Jack and Twitter, obviously. It's Facebook, where Vice President Andrew Bosworth wrote in a leaked internal memo back in 2016. The ugly truth is, we believe in connecting people so deeply that anything that connects more people more often is a de facto good, even if it costs someone a life by exposing them to bullies, even if someone dies in a terrorist attack. And it's not just Facebook, it's Instagram. And it's not just Instagram, it's Tumblr. Our social infrastructure has become nothing but machinery for outrage and fear. So we draw back into smaller, more private, intentional communities. We spend our time in permanent group chats, in social discords and Slacks. And even within those communities, we have to create smaller and more private spaces. Every social Slack I'm in has a women's only channel. And the problem is that these tools we're using to create these more intentional communities, they weren't built with these use cases in mind necessarily. And at first you don't notice the problem because everyone has chosen to come together around a shared interest. But as a fandom Slack or a design industry Slack grows to have hundreds and in some cases thousands of members, they essentially become public spaces again, but without any of the curation tools we need. You can't block or mute people. You can't filter your feed because that's not what these tools were built for. So we try in these more intentional spaces, we create codes of conduct and rules. And where do these rules almost always start? Some exhortation to be polite to one another, some variant of Wheaton's law. And from there, it's not much of a leap to say that one of the rules of the group is that we should keep politics out of the discussion, as some proxy for making everyone feel welcome, when what we actually mean is making the majority feel comfortable. Here's an example that Carl Kingsbury recently shared on Twitter from the Scala community. One member is trying to have a discussion about decisions to invite controversial speakers to speak at a community conference. And almost immediately, you see other members move to shut that conversation down. Don't bring that into this forum. I come here for the programming. Keep the political drama away. I've seen the same conversation unfold in Harry Potter fan fiction communities and boy band groups and even in private group chats. Are you sensing a theme? It's the same refrain we heard from the comic book guys. Keep the politics out. It's not what we're here for. But there's no such thing as a neutral space. The decision to have an apolitical community is an inherently political decision. Now, if you're paying attention, you'll realize I've just presented you with two extremely contradictory ideas. Messy, unmoderated public spaces like Twitter or Tumblr are terrible for underrepresented voices because they get harassed, drowned out, and driven away. But smaller, private, more intentional spaces don't allow underrepresented voices to point out racism, misogyny, transphobia without asking someone for permission. I started thinking about this dichotomy recently when I read this great article about racism in the knitting community. Social media makes pointing out racism easier than ever. And for weeks, knitters used Instagram, and specifically Instagram stories, to share their experiences and tag other knitters and conduct polls. Hundreds of knitters of colour shared stories about being ignored in knitting stores, having white knitters assume they were poor or complete amateurs, or flat out saying they didn't think black or Asian people could knit. One person who participated said, "I don't think this conversation could have happened anywhere else. There isn't anywhere else where the community exists and is somewhat uncensored and able to react to one another. The temporality of Instagram stories is what let them feel free to voice their concerns." Similarly, speaking about racism in fan communities recently, Rukmini Panda said, "They can kick you out of a chat. They can kick you out of a Discord." And I see some non-white fans saying, "I'm not really comfortable with the idea of going into a private Discord where the premium, once again, is on niceness, on not rocking the boat." So what could we do? Get Thanos to snap half of us off the internet?
Here we go, Reddit users.
We can't give up that easily. We need to focus on the heroes and not the villains. And I think there are 5 things that we can do, starting today, to be the heroes that we need to see in the world. The first thing that we need to do is wield the power that we already have. As consumers, when we make it clear to companies that bad PR is a problem they have to do something about, and as advertisers, when we don't allow brands to be shown alongside objectionable content, which goes straight to the bottom line. As employees, you all are some of the most sought-after employees in the world right now. You have so much more power than you think you do. Collective action and collective bargaining are incredibly important tools for change. The employees of Vox Media unionized last year and have just ratified their first collective bargain. And in addition to the financial and other protections they won, they also achieved things like this: diversity pledge. And that's important because the second thing we need is more diversity. Even after 10 years of diversity and inclusion efforts, the tech sector still remains overwhelmingly male and overwhelmingly white and Asian. And that matters in this context because political and social issues are often not considered or flat out ignored because underrepresented voices are not at the table when technology is designed, discussed, tested, and implemented. Inclusive innovation with marginalized groups in positions of power would have produced very different outcomes. For example, an engineer from a community historically targeted by voter suppression efforts would have been far more likely to anticipate the sort of vulnerabilities we saw exploited on Facebook by Cambridge Analytica. Even one of Twitter's co-founders has acknowledged this fundamental truth about that company's history. More than that, though, we need more regulation. Every libertarian in the room's hackles just went up, but the evidence is becoming insurmountable. Social media companies already have to comply with Germany's laws prohibiting the spread of pro-Nazi propaganda, and it should be true everywhere. The argument that it's too hard technically is given lie to over and over again. Platforms have almost completely eradicated the spread of ISIS content. Technical solutions work just fine to remove commercial or branded content, or when it suits a company financially. Here's me having a truly infuriating conversation with an Airbnb host in which we were attempting to exchange personal details so that we could get in touch with each other offline. Again and again, automatically hidden by Airbnb. And yet, when Dr. Christine Blasey Ford's personal details were repeatedly shared online, forcing her to move house more than once, the answer from Twitter was just a 12-hour suspension after the fact. These companies do make small changes under pressure. Twitter now shows you warnings when you try to search for anti-vax content. Facebook and Google both made small changes to live streaming rules after Christchurch. But it's not nearly enough. We need new regulatory tools. Regulation, though, is always going to be a blunt instrument. So the fourth thing we need is companies with values. Private companies need to abandon this myth of neutrality and determine what it is that they stand for, what their values are. Rules can always be gamed. So companies need to be able to come back to their core principles, their values when they're making these decisions, and they need to make those values clear. Cloudflare, a company which protects websites from attacks, decided to terminate the account of white supremacist website The Daily Stormer in 2017, but is now refusing similar calls to stop working to keep 8chan online, saying it doesn't want to get into the business of deciding what is and isn't appropriate. YouTube flails around and can't decide whether it's going to demonetize hate speech or not, engages in one-off purges of extremist content, and winds up taking down history professors' videos about the Nazi regime. It's ad hoc, it's inconsistent, and it's seemingly without principle. We know that deplatforming works now. Data and society research shows that social media personalities see consistent drop-offs in audiences when they're kicked off major platforms, and that they don't regain the same amplification power that they had. A study by Georgia Tech researchers showed that after Reddit banned some of its most toxic subreddits, hate speech was down across the site, even from people who had been particularly active in those subreddits. We need companies to come down off the fence. If you're not prepared to determine what it is that you stand for, then profit is going to do it for you. Last year, one of the oldest gaming forums on the internet made its stance clear. Just this week, Ravelry, the online knitting community, did the same. Pinterest has made it clear that anti-vax content isn't welcome on its platform. Salesforce has made it clear that people trying to sell firearms are not welcome to use its e-commerce technology. Fastly noted in its S1 filing in advance of its IPO in the United States that making ethical business decisions might mean they're not maximizing for short-term financial gain. But you know what? Not behaving ethically is going to be a far greater business risk in the future. And fifthly, and finally, we need to build with that future in mind. In addition to holding these existing companies to account, we need to think about the things that we're building right now, all of us, the people in this room. In his new book, Ruined by Design, which I can't recommend strongly enough, Mike Monteiro wrote recently, doing good work isn't a matter of location. It's a matter of craft and responsibility. If you want to do good work, start doing it now. Start doing it at your day job. Start by asking questions about what it is that you're building, about who benefits from it, and who gets hurt. Last year, a toolkit called Ethical OS was released. It's a partnership between the Institute for the Future and the Tech Society and Solutions Lab. And it functions as a kind of workbook with problem sets and checklists and thought experiments for design and development teams, for founders and investors, to grapple with the future impact of the products that they're building. The decisions we take today are critical in determining the kind of world we get to live in the future. It's worth fighting for. I still believe in heroes. Heroes know that the world we live in isn't and can't ever be apolitical. And so instead, we need to build products and platforms that understand that make space for communities, that make people feel safe, regardless of their race or their age or their gender, regardless of their sexual orientation, regardless of their gender identity. We're the ones who can change this. In fact, we're the only ones who can. We're the heroes that we need to see in the world. It's up to us.
Today we have a chance to take it all back. We will. Whatever it takes. Whatever it takes. Whatever it takes.
Thank you.